Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. I'm Dee Dee Lageson, Executive Secretary for the Committee on the Present Danger China. We appreciate your flexibility with respect to the timing of these weekly webinars in which we expose and analyze the Chinese Communist Party's unrestricted warfare against America and the help being provided to the CCP in waging that warfare by captured U.S. elites. Our 2023 programs will air regularly on Thursdays at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, with some exceptions. Next week's webinar is one of those exceptions. Our next program will broadcast live on Tuesday, January 10th at 1 p.m. Eastern. If you are a subscriber to this series, we will continue to do our best to give you advance notice about changes in the timing of these programs. We encourage you to visit presentdangerchina.org for regular updates. Our past webinars and tons of other very valuable content are posted there too. Our moderator today is Frank Gaffney. Frank is the Executive Chairman of the Center for Security Policy, Vice Chair for the Committee on the Present Danger China, and host of Securing America with Frank Gaffney on Real America's Voice Network. And with that, let's get started, Frank.
Welcome, everyone. This is perhaps one of the most difficult of the programs we've performed to date under the rubric of the Committee on the Present Danger China's series of webinars concerning the unrestricted warfare the Chinese Communist Party has been waging against our country, the help that they have been receiving in doing so from Americans. It's the most difficult, arguably, because it is the most horrific. We're going to describe in some detail a practice that the Chinese Communist Party has been engaged in industrial scale that involves the murderous extraction of organs from human beings who have been targeted because of their perceived threat to the regime, their ethnicity, or simply the fact that they are expedient sources of a commodity from which the Chinese Communist Party is profiting handsomely. We're going to talk about this practice. I call it organ genocide because of the scale on which it is being inflicted upon the people of China. And as we're fond of pointing out in these programs, any regime that treats its own people so mercilessly, so horrifically, is unlikely to treat ours or others any better. This is particularly relevant in light of a prospect that we will discuss in the course of today's program, which is that the Chinese Communist Party is not content on inflicting this nightmarish butchery on their own ethnicities, minorities, religious communities, and the like, but they're exporting the practice to others who stand to benefit as well from the profitability of the forcible extraction, the involuntary extraction of organs. Worse, for us at least, is the distinct possibility that one of the purposes of the big data collection that the Chinese Communist Party has been engaged in America, as we've discussed on these programs, notably through vehicles like TikTok, that enable them to obtain not just a lot of personal, private health information, but even, in some cases at least, DNA data that can be used in the future, perhaps for the harvesting of the organs of Americans as well. So this is not just some crime against humanity that's happening in some distant land. This is a present danger, and one certainly that is likely to become more so here at home in the future. For all these reasons, we are very grateful to a distinguished panel of experts who have been studying and working to counter this barbaric practice of the Chinese Communist Party. We're going to start one of the leaders in this effort, not only to document, but to counter forced organ harvesting, or, if you will, organ genocide by the CCP. His name is Dr. Torsten Trey. He is, among other things, the founder of Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. And you can find out more about it at dafoh.org. He is the author of An Unprecedented Evil Persecution, a Genocide Against Goodness in Humankind. And we've asked him a little bit about the forced organ harvesting that is taking place in the People's Republic of China for profit and for genocide against unwanted persons and populations. Dr. Trey, welcome to our program. Thank you very much for your contribution to it. Over to you, sir.
Thank you, Frank, for this very respectful introduction. It's an honor to speak in your series of webinars, which is such a remarkable source of information about China. We talk about forced organ harvesting, and what we understand usually is about this is that people are being killed to harvest their organs. It is usually state organized, because if it's just a single crime, it would be prosecuted immediately. But if it's state organized, it can take on industrial level. And we have first heard about this in 2006. And that was a shock to the world when we heard that China was harvesting organs from persecuted Falun Gong practitioners. And this is an important aspect. Like you cannot talk about the Holocaust without mentioning Nazi Germans and the Jewish people. And the same is with forced organ harvesting in China. You have to mention China and the main victims, which are Falun Gong practitioners. Some people might say that it is political to talk about China, but it is the aspect that they are the perpetrator of this crime against humanity that forces us to talk about it. So what does it mean? Living people, prisoners of conscience in China, detained people are being categorized, medically examined, and on demand killed. And then their organs are sold for profit for transplantation. So when we talk about this, this is a big allegation, but how did we come to this conclusion? And people ask for the evidence. Basically, since 2006, a large amount of investigations has been done, and to categorize this or to summarize this in three aspects, we would say our evidence is based on the transplant numbers. China produces an enormous amount of transplants, which is not reflected by its organ donation program. Besides, the numbers of the transplants take on a shape, a form, a course, which is completely unusual for any transplant, for any other country that conducts transplants, which show more a gradual increase of transplants. But in China, it is an up and down. It's a roller coaster according to the international attention. Besides, the wait time is extremely short. Sometimes it's 2 weeks, sometimes 2 days. So the amount of transplants if you consider it over 20 years, has reached a number which should force us to take it serious. We are talking about more than a million people, maybe several million of people who have been killed over the past 20 years for their organs. The second aspect is the organ donation program in China, which is not in the same relation to the actual transplants, meaning the amount of registered organ donors is so small that in comparison to other countries, it is implausible that they can produce this amount of transplants. Besides, an analysis of the organ donor program showed that the numbers are manufactured. So we don't have a trustworthy system in China. The third aspect, which we consider as evidence, is the witnesses and the testimonies, as well from victims, but also from bystanders or interviews. David had started this by doing phone calls to China, and doctors have made admissions. So all of this together let us come to the conclusion that forced organ harvesting, the killing of living people, in particular from persecuted Falun Gong practitioners, takes place in China. So when we consider all this, and also reflect that this is a rather concealed movement, because concealed crime, because we don't know as much about it, then to put this into perspective, we can probably say that the forced organ harvesting of living people in China is probably the most and best investigated crime against humanity of a concealed crime that is not being discussed in the mainstream media. And that is one concern. We have to address this. When we were looking into this aspect of forced organ harvesting, our Falun Gong practitioners, we actually looked into a certain theory. We considered it as we explored if this amounts to the definition of a genocide. And upon investigating this claim over 2 years, we found actually that this is a particular form of genocide, which we called a co-genocide. It is a destruction of a group that takes place, but in a slow motion, in a slow moving pattern. It is, by doing so, it is more difficult to detect. And this is a critical aspect here. If we compare to the student massacre in 1989, we noticed that on one day, 3,000 students were killed, which triggered an international outcry. This was a lesson to China. China knew that they cannot do the same with other unwanted groups and people in China. They have to resort to other methods. And this is this slow-moving eradication process. And if you consider that, just to illustrate that, if you take for a moment, if we assume that maybe 50 prisoners of conscience are being killed for the organs every day, and you extrapolate this over 20 years, then you reach a number that is crossing 500,000 people. So if you compare the destruction on the Tiananmen Square in 1989, which triggered a lot of attention in the media, then you can see that the media does not pick up the killing for organs, the forced organ harvesting in China, although multiple more times of people were killed for forced organ harvesting. This should trigger some serious reconsideration in our media and also in our politicians that this needs to be addressed more than the student massacre, just because it is not so, or the intensity is not as high as on that day in June 1989. It does not mean that the crime is neglectable. But over the years, we were of course taking action, and we tried to raise awareness on this. And in some parts, parliaments have passed resolutions or legislation. But we found that this is not as, it didn't stop China. So we looked into this. What is it, what China is, what the CCP is pursuing with this forced organ harvesting as a state organized crime? I believe it's not so much the profit. The profit is for the doctors who perform the operations, so that it becomes a self-propelling mechanism, a machinery to reach industrial level numbers of transplants. But the intention, the purpose of the CCP to propel this forced organ harvesting is rather to transfer the execution from the courtroom to the operation room. So the intention, the goal of the CCP is the eradication. So we have to look into this aspect. Why does the CCP want to eradicate Falun Gong? In a way, killing people under the preface of harvesting the organs for transplant. The idea is to bring this particular group of Falun Gong to silence. Which way is more efficient to silence a group than killing all the members of the group? So if we think this way, then actually this aspect helps us to defeat the forced organ harvesting. And that is, we have to break the silence, not only about forced organ harvesting, but we also have to break the silence about Falun Gong. Because if we talk about Falun Gong, if we talk about their practice and the values that they bring to the Chinese society, then the purpose of the CCP to eradicate Falun Gong is basically defeated. And if we take this in a stronger perspective, then we would say that actually by bringing up this issue, by maintaining a discussion about Falun Gong, by conducting a conversation why they are persecuted, it is not only helping to defeat and stop the forced organ harvesting in China, but it also actually helps to stop the CCP with meddling in our society, because the CCP aims to by promoting this forced organ harvesting and triggering these large numbers of transplantation, the CCP aims to become a leader in the transplant field, and by being a leader in the transplant field, they would have all the tools to set the standards. And this is where Frank comes in with his comment that the forced organ harvesting could extend to our society once the CCP controls the standards of transplantation. It can also push for to harvest organs from any kind of people from the society, and therefore pushing for transplantation, larger transplantation numbers. So there is indeed a risk in our society. If China sets the standards, we have to face a new situation. And with these words, I give back to Frank.
Dr. Trey, thank you very much. This is a very helpful introduction to the topic. I particularly found instructive your point about the Chinese Communist Party's desire to engage in this ocean genocide by removing it from the courtroom to the operating room. It's cynical, but characteristic, I think, of the Chinese Communists that they would find a mechanism to accomplish several purposes simultaneously. Perhaps not so much profit, though I have the feeling that's operating, but as well, this liquidation of an unwanted population, in particular the Falun Gong. We're going to turn next to the insights of another individual who has been following very closely these horrific practices of the Chinese Communist Party for many years. He is a Canadian international human rights lawyer by avocation, co-founder of the International Coalition to End Transplant Abuse in China, the co-author of what was initially a 2006 report that subsequently became a book entitled Blood Harvest, The Killing of Falun Gong for Their Organs. His name is David Matas, Esquire. He has been nominated for his work for the Nobel Peace Prize. And he has also co-edited with Dr. Trey an important book entitled State Organs, Transplant Abuse in China. We've asked Mr. Matas to expand upon the point that Dr. Trey concluded with, namely the weaponization of this barbarism for the purposes of disposing of those the Chinese Communist Party fears, envies, or otherwise considers to be a problem and seeks to eliminate through this mechanism of forced organ harvesting and genocide. Mr. Matas, the floor is yours, sir. Welcome.
Thank you. The evidence of the mass killing of prisoners of conscience for their organs in China is overwhelming. The victims have been, since the early 2000s, primarily practitioners of this spiritually based set of exercises, Falun Gong. Also, Uyghurs have been victims in large numbers since their mass detention in 2017. Victims in smaller but significant numbers are Tibetans and House Christians. An independent people's tribunal, the China Tribunal, has determined after public hearings and an avalanche of evidence that the mass killing of Falun Gong for their organs has occurred and was occurring beyond a reasonable doubt. The tribunal determined with a final judgment in 2020 the slaughter to be a crime against humanity. The tribunal was less certain about whether the crime of genocide had occurred. The tribunal had no doubt that the act of genocide happened and was happening. Their uncertainty focused on intent. The tribunal was less certain whether there was the requisite intent, the intent to destroy the group in whole or in part. They suggested that the issue could be determined by the International Court of Justice on request for an advisory opinion made by the General Assembly. The title of the presentation I'm making today raises the same issue, the issue of intent. Is the Communist Chinese Party weaponizing organ harvesting to inflict genocide against its unwanted? There's no doubt that forced organ harvesting with prisoner of conscience victims is occurring. But is what the title of my talk suggests the real reason that this forced organ harvesting is occurring? Is the mass killing of prisoners of conscience for their organs inflicted as a means of genocide against the unwanted? Or is there some other reason for these mass killings? The hesitancy of the China Tribunal about intent for the crime of genocide arose for 4 different reasons. One was the standard of proof. The China Tribunal used the criminal standard of proof. proof beyond a reasonable doubt. That standard is necessary for criminal convictions, whether by national courts under universal jurisdiction or by an international tribunal with jurisdiction over the crimes. However, for civil proceedings, intent need be established only on a balance of probabilities. The tribunal did not address the question whether the requisite intent for genocide was established on a balance of probabilities. In my view, that intent has been established on a balance of probabilities. Civil proceedings could be actions for damages by relatives of those killed, and the proceedings could be conducted in national courts outside of China. Civil proceedings could also be actions against the government of China itself under the Genocide Convention. China is a state party to the Genocide Convention, and so are most other states. Any state party to the convention can ask the International Court of Justice to find that China has violated the convention by its mass killing of prisoners of conscience for their organs. China has made a reservation, opting out of the provision in the convention, which gives the court jurisdiction to decide disputes between states parties. However, another treaty, the Vienna Convention on the Law of Treaties, provides that reservations cannot be contrary to the object and purpose of the treaty. China is also a state party to the Vienna Convention, as are most other states. It is my view that the China reservation on access to the court for settlement of disputes under the Genocide Convention is contrary to the object and purposes of that treaty. The International Court of Justice, in a case by the Republic of Congo against Rwanda, held that a similar reservation by Rwanda was not contrary to the object and purposes of the Genocide Convention. Nonetheless, the statute of the International Court of Justice provides that the court is not bound by precedent, so the issue remains open in a case against China. A second reason of the China Tribunal for hesitancy about intent for the crime of genocide is the fact that, as Torsten Trey has mentioned, huge sums of money are being made from forced organ harvesting. The extracted organs are sold on demand to transplant tourists and wealthy Chinese in amounts which total in aggregate billions of dollars. A person accused of a crime can act for more than one motive. In the case of genocide, when one motive is profit and a second is intent to destroy the group in whole or in part, the requisite intent for genocide is made out. While the crime of genocide requires an intent to destroy the group in whole or in part, that intent need not be the sole intent. Even if that intent is one of several, the requisite intent for genocide is made out. The hospitals and health practitioners who earn fortunes from forced organ harvesting presumably know who the victims are or are willfully blind to the victimization. But is this knowledge or willful blindness enough to establish the requisite intent for genocide, the intent to destroy the group in whole or in part? Health practitioners engaged in forced organ harvesting of prisoners of conscience are no doubt guilty of crimes against humanity. But can they escape conviction for genocide by pleading that they killed for money and not with intent to destroy the group of which their victims formed part? In my view, knowledge or willful blindness are sufficient to establish the requisite intent. The statute of the International Criminal Court, in its article on individual responsibility, provides that a person is criminally responsible for all crimes within the jurisdiction of the court, including genocide, if the person contributes to the commission of the crime by a group of persons acting with a common purpose. The contribution has to be intentional and must either be made with the aim of furthering the criminal activity or criminal purpose of the group, or be made in knowledge of the intention of the group to commit the crime. So knowledge is sufficient according to the statute of the court. The acting with the aim of furthering the criminal activity or criminal purpose of the group is not essential. So the issue becomes not so much whether health practitioners want to destroy in whole or in part the group from which their victims are drawn. The issue is rather whether there is such a group with a common purpose outside the health system which has this intent, and health practitioners engaged in forced organ harvesting know of this intent. If one considers the plain wording of the court statute and includes willful blindness as a component of knowledge, an inclusion for which there's substantial international legal support, it would seem clear that health practitioners are indeed guilty of genocide. However, even if that is not so, there are others who have the requisite intent, because for them, and again, as Torsten has pointed out, profit is not the primary motive. Genocide of the victim groups is inflicted not just by health practitioners in the health system. It is inflicted by the legal system, the investigators, the police, the courts, the detention centers, the whole apparatus that places these victim communities in arbitrary and indefinite detention. And victims of institutionalized forced organ harvesting come from jails and detention centers. They are not kidnapped by hospitals off the streets. The system of oppression is in turn commanded and demanded by the Chinese Communist Party, again, as Torsten has pointed out. The Chinese Communist Party is not killing their victim groups en masse for funds to finance the health system. For the party, the money to be made from the mass killing of prisoners of conscience for their organs is a welcome side effect, but not the purpose for which the victimization occurs. Even as the health practitioners could avoid conviction for genocide on the basis that they are killing for money and do not have the requisite intent, and I suggest they couldn't avoid it that way, but even if they could, that is not a defense which could be plausibly raised by either by the Chinese Communist Party or by the legal and detention system, which acts out the dictates of the party. The third concern that the China Tribunal had about intent related to the issue of conversion. The primary intent of the party in repressing the victim groups is to advance and promote by force loyalty to the party. Those in the victim groups who show sufficient loyalty to the party through word and deed are released, not killed for their organs, even if this profession of loyalty happens after torture. The crime of genocide requires physical destruction. The crime of genocide does not include cultural genocide. If everyone converts and no one is killed, there's no physical destruction and therefore no genocide. However, those are not the facts here. There's massive physical destruction of victim groups through forced organ harvesting. Moreover, those who genuinely converted to loyalty to the Communist Party have left the group, the targeted victim group. The relevant targeted victim group does not include those who have left the group. So that concern of the China Tribunal, in my view, was not well-founded. The fourth intent issue raised by the China Tribunal is the release, in some cases, of members of the victim groups without conversion, and that does indeed happen. The party, in some cases, has engaged in a catch and release practice as a warning to those caught and their families. The China Tribunal wondered whether there was the requisite genocide intent because of this phenomenon. My own view is that this catch and release practice does not throw into question the existence of the requisite intent for genocide. One reason is that a warning through catch and release is not the end of the matter. The targeted group members caught and released ignore the warnings at their peril, continue on their past ways, continue in the practice of Falun Gong, or continue practicing the Muslim faith if you're Uyghurs and so on. They run a grave risk of redetention with a concomitant risk of forced organ harvesting. The problem just doesn't go away because of the catch and release. Secondly, genocide as a victim group can be committed with intent to destroy a group in whole or in part. Intent to destroy the group as a whole is not necessary to commit the crime of genocide. Intent to destroy the group in part is sufficient. The catch and release system, it shows at most only that there's not an intent to destroy every single member of the group. However, because the requisite intent for genocide does not require intent to destroy the group as a whole and allows for only intent to destroy the group in part, the release of some members of the group without conversion does not undermine the conclusion that the target groups are victims of genocide. So the answer to the question posed by the title of my talk, is the Communist Chinese Party weaponizing organ harvesting to inflict genocide against its unwanted? My answer is yes. The Communist Chinese Party is indeed weaponizing organ harvesting to inflict genocide against its unwanted.
Mr. Matas, it's a very thorough legal opinion that you have rendered here, and I appreciate you walking us through some of the nuances, but also some, it would seem, of the shortcomings of this otherwise quite impressive investigation conducted by the International Tribunal in London. And I'm sure we'll talk thoughts about the rest of them in our Q&A session. But before we get there, we're going to speak with another medical doctor. His name is Weldon Gilcrease. He is an associate professor of oncology at the University of Utah School of Medicine, also a Huntsman Cancer Institute investigator. We've asked him to address the topic that I think weighs in particular on the conscience of all of us against the backdrop of what has been shared in terms of the truly horrific character of what's afoot here, namely the Western enablers of this practice, those who using their own medical clientele to foster it, to finance it, to otherwise support the organ transplanting taking place at, as I said earlier, an industrial scale in China. Notably, as was mentioned earlier, with the fastest turnaround from request for transplant to delivery of an organ matched to the transplantees' requirements. This is something that obviously is attractive to those seeking to nurture ill patients, but also an enabling of something genuinely barbarous. So to speak to that point, I'm very pleased to have Weldon Gilcrease with us. And Doctor, thank you for joining us for this purpose.
I'm really honored to be part of this panel, and I'm honored to be talking about this topic today. As Frank mentioned, I'm a medical doctor here at the University of Utah. I'm also the deputy director for Doctors Against Forced Organ Harvesting. And there's a couple of points before I kind of get started, and I'll try to tell my story through a timeline and actually go back to 2019, which actually seems like a lifetime away, and start from 2019 and kind of work backwards. But the couple of things that I want to point out that I think is really important for the audience is, number one, the Chinese Communist Party, the ruling government of China, is not China. It's not the Chinese people. It's not the Chinese scientists. It's not the Chinese physicians. I think Mr. Matus pointed out very well this problem of willful blindness in China, but I think we have a real problem of willful blindness here in the United States, and I'm hoping to give some more paint to that picture. So the story that I want to kind of tell, and a couple things that I want to highlight to make sure that the audience is clear on this, is in the 1990s, if you look at China and you look at transplant, China was doing very, very little transplant. They had no organ donation system. They had no organ distribution system. In fact, they've never really had a successful organ donation or distribution system. They tried to set one up in 2015, and there was a publication in 2019 showing how this data was cooked up and was falsified. So you have a country that culturally doesn't believe in transplant. It's sort of not palatable from a cultural standpoint in Southeast Asia to donate organs from a dead body. And so what happens in the early 2000s is you see an explosion of transplant activity in China. China goes from doing about 15 to 20 liver transplants per year to 3,000 by their own publication in The Lancet, with the first author being Wang Jifu, a transplant surgeon and one of the transplant leaders in China. So you have this explosion, this exponential increase in the number of transplants that China is doing, and no explanation for where they're coming from. And this is where David Matus and David Kilgore come in 2006 and publish the first report on forced organ harvesting. To kind of speed up to where I wanted to start is in 2019, because I think 2019 is a really important year. The first report that came out, I think, was a little over 200 pages, and David Matus and David Kilgore looked at 33 different evidentiary trails of evidence showing that forced organ harvesting was happening. I think one of the important pieces to recognize and for the audience to recognize is that the predominant organ source were the Falun Gong and are the Falun Gong practitioners in China. And who are and what are Falun Gong and why were they targeted by the Chinese Communist Party? Well, the Chinese Communist Party in 1999 under Jiang Zemin launched a persecution against this practice, never actually officially banning the practice, but they began to put these practitioners in their Laogai and prison systems and labor camps and detention centers throughout China. At the time, in 1999, there were 70 to 100 million Falun Gong practitioners. It was a loosely organized group of Buddhist meditators and Buddhist practitioners whose faith revolve around the principles of truth, compassion, and tolerance. And indeed, truth, compassion, and tolerance is antithetical to the Chinese Communist Party's ethos. And so this became a real threat to the Chinese Communist Party. There were actually more Falun Gong practitioners than there were active Chinese Communist Party members in 1999 when the practice was illegally banned. Now, this set in motion anywhere from 500,000 to 1 million, or some of the estimates, Falun Gong practitioners being put in detention centers, some of them unnamed and anonymous, and all of the healthy ones with an unusual story that Mr. Matus has heard a number of times, and I've heard a number of times, of medical tests as they were being put into these labor camps, as they were being tortured, that didn't make sense. So 2006, the first report comes out that shows that forced organ harvesting is indeed happening. And then in 2016, there's a 780-page report. Mr. Matus is one of the authors, along with David Kilgore and Ethan Gutman. And this essentially looked at 165 different transplant centers throughout China and came to this number that China, unlike what it was officially reporting, was doing somewhere between 60 and 100,000 transplants per year. To put this in context, the United States, officially number one in transplants in terms of volume, does about 38,000 transplants per year. So between those two reports, that sort of set the stage for the International Tribunal, which I believe convened in 2018 and spent a year interviewing over 50 witnesses and experts, including Torsten Trey on the panel and David Matus. And they came to this conclusion that beyond reasonable doubt, forced organ harvesting was happening in China. I would encourage the audience to read the 3.5-page short form. If you just Google China Tribunal, you can find this short form. And in it, there was an important message, and that is governments and any who interact in any substantial way with the Chinese Communist Party, including doctors, medical institutions, educational institutions, businesses, and industry, should now recognize, based on their findings, that they are dealing with a criminal state. So this is 2019. All of a sudden, with that 560-page report by the tribunal and the findings of the 7 members unanimously finding that forced organ harvesting was indeed happening in China, is happening in China, and that Falun Gong were the primary victim group, this all of a sudden establishes over 1,400 pages of data, predominantly Chinese data, showing that forced organ harvesting was happening and wasn't slowing down. So what else happened in 2019? And I'll finish up this last couple of minutes with something that I think is really important. In 2019, just in the field of oncology, we saw 9 top scientists and physicians have to leave their posts because they weren't reporting money that they were receiving from the Chinese government through something called the 1,000 Talents Program. The 1,000 Talents Program was established in 2008 in China and was essentially a way to conscript top scientists around the world and basically pay them to be under and collaborate with the Chinese government and Chinese institutions. So at Moffitt Cancer Center in Florida, what we saw was 6 scientists, including their CEO, have to leave. Now, I think converging the findings of the tribunal saying, without a doubt, forced organ harvesting is happening and it's criminal activity, and then seeing at the same time the collaboration with U.S. institutions really highlights the fact that we are complicit. Where did a country that didn't do very many transplants at all and all of a sudden was doing thousands learn the art of transplant and the science of transplant? In the United States and in the Western world. And the other point I often will make is we have no reliable way of finding out what Americans would go to and travel to China and pay money to essentially have an unethically sourced organ. So these are the I think this sort of sets the stage. And you go again back in 2019 and you see the tribunal release their findings on top of this sort of opaque reporting on what was happening at medical institutions. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Again, a really important part of the story we need to tell here has just been fleshed out. We have a number of very interesting and important questions from our audience, and some that have occurred to me too, and we'll try to go through a round or two in the time we have left. And I want to thank each of you for both being very disciplined in your time as well as in the wonderful communication that you've engaged in. I wanted to pick up on a point that I made, and I think we had a question from our audience about as well. And that is this idea that big data that is being collected in the form of these various genetic research operations, Ancestry.com is one, I guess, 23andMe is another one. I believe at least one of them, and maybe both, have ownership stakes, at least in China. And we talked a bit about the extent to which the Chinese, by becoming a dominant force in the transplant business, I guess if you could call it that, worldwide, might set the standards for transplants, and that could be problematic. And indeed, I'm sure it can be, and maybe one or more of you would like to comment on that. But the thing that has informed these programs is that the Chinese Communist Party is determined to destroy the United States. That is its stated, explicit purpose. So I guess what I have been thinking about in connection with data being collected on Americans, and another sources I mentioned, TikTok, being that should they in fact succeed in taking over this country one way or another, one source of organs and one vehicle for eliminating unwanted populations could well be the translation of that data into harvesting here. Dr. Trey, I might direct this question to you. Is that something that we ought to be concerned about, given what we've seen in China, what we know is their agenda, and the relevance of what they're doing by collecting this data, perhaps in the future, for this kind of application as well?
Yes, indeed, this is a problem. Earlier, I compared the student massacre which was public to the view. And then the cold genocide, which is the slow-moving, concealed destruction of the Falun Gong movement in China. If you take this comparison, one is more visible, one is more slow-moving, concealed, then you get a lot of answers how China is operating. For example, in order to get the DNA of the American people, they would not officially collect the DNA from Americans, but what they do is they watch until certain American companies who are collecting the DNA have collected a certain amount of DNA, and then they buy this company. They buy the company that has already collected the DNA, and then the DNA becomes immediately accessible to the CCP. And this is if you want, this is a very concealed subversion of our societies. It happens not only in the business, it happens in the academic field, it happens at universities with the notorious Confucius Institutes. You always find this pattern that the CCP doesn't show its colors. It works in a concealed way and get the information in a hidden way. Why? China is actually very active to get information about us. Why? Because information is the gateway to control, and that's basically the common denominator of any actions of the CCP. They seek the control in all aspects in our society.
Yeah. And this is part of why I'm asking the question, is that this ongoing conversation, particularly, I think it's fair to say, in the context of TikTok, that young people especially, but many of us who have been using social media or other internet platforms have a certain, well, the French would say insouciance, lax attitude about the privacy of our personal information, health data, and so on. And to the extent that we are, in fact, seeing it hoovered up by people who may well have in mind exploiting it for control, yes, perhaps for destruction purposes, it is something I think we need to be very mindful of. Let me ask you, and I may have been mispronouncing your name, David Mattis, the issue of the criminality of what the Chinese Communist Party is up to here. I think you've made a very persuasive case that it does indeed rise to the level of not only actual genocide, but intentional genocide. Mention was made of bringing cases against the CCP and people having standing to do that. Would it be helpful to that end if the United States government, hard to imagine under this administration to be sure, but nonetheless, on the basis of the merits of the case, to designate the Chinese Communist Party as a transnational criminal organization?
I'm not completely familiar with U.S. law and whether there is such a form of designation under American law that
there is
a transnational criminal organization.
Mm-hmm.
Yes, well, certainly that's something that the China Tribunal said. That you have to realize when you're dealing with the government of China, you are dealing with a criminal organization. And so it would make sense to say that. I mean, it's transnational in the sense that it operates internationally. And the crime of organ harvesting is also a transnational crime because of the fact that there's this transplant tourist influx. And the hospitals are advertising, and there's brokers, and there's a whole facilitation throughout the world. If anybody wants to go to China for a transplant and has enough money, no matter what the country of origin, they could do so unless either the international system prevents it or the national system does. There's now 20 countries that have legislation against transplant tourism into China, but the U.S. is not one of them. Designating China as a transnational criminal organization, I think would be possible, even appropriate. But of course, it's very general. It doesn't specifically mention organ harvesting. And the more specific we get, as far as I'm concerned, the more likely it is to be effective. I think we have to hone in on the particular crime. And well, I would welcome the designation. I would say if there's one thing immediately that the U.S. has to do on this issue, it's to criminalize transplant tourism into China. And that remains to be done.
Thank you. I asked the question in part because our Committee on the Present Danger China has been advocating that the Chinese Communist Party is designated as a transnational criminal organization for some time. And I think, as you know better than I, such a designation would surely have to make specific references to of its criminal activity. And this, unfortunately, given the nature of the CCP, would be one of, but only one of a number of activities that would fall into such a bill of particulars, I think. Can I come to you, Doctor? Dr. Gilchrist, we've been talking a bit about Falun Gong as a specific target of this effort to dispose of unwanted people. But we've also had introduced several other groups that are being targeted as well, Tibetans, House Christians, and I think particularly Uyghurs and other Turkic minorities. I'm told that there's now a specific premium on the organs being harvested from the Muslim communities on the grounds that they can be sold as halal organs. That is to say, not contaminated by the consumption of pork or anything else that others might have in their systems. Could you give us, if that's something you could speak to, could you give us a sense of how large that particular market is these days, and the extent to which really what has been sort of alluded to here as an industrial scale operation with streamlined access to the airports and to the hospitals and all the rest of it that I think we just heard Mr. Matas refer to as transplant tourism. The extent to which this is a thing in China now.
I don't know the issue of halal organs or Uyghur organs. I do know that there are roughly as many as 2 million Uyghurs that are in essentially concentration camps in Xinjiang in Western China. But just to give you kind of sort of take a step back and look at the entire population of the unwanted, as David Matus has called them, throughout China. In 1999, again, there were 70 to 100 million Falun Gong practitioners. I think the most recent Freedom Report from about 2 years ago or 3 years ago said that there's still about 20 million in China Falun Gong practitioners. The number of Uyghurs, there's about 13 million Uyghurs in Xinjiang, and that population has diminished substantially over the last 7 decades under Chinese communist rule. I think you are right. There's a lot of infrastructure that's being built in Xinjiang and Western China. And then just to touch on some of the other populations, Tibetans, House Christians, which make up smaller populations, and then political dissidents, I think are the targeted unwanteds that I think we've been talking about today. I mean, I think what makes a healthy organ, it was also why Falun Gong became such a big target. is that this is a population that doesn't drink, doesn't smoke. And I think you are right that with a savvy political party that is after not only profit, but extinguishing a group and then making profit from it, that the Falun Gong became very susceptible to forced organ harvesting because it was such a healthy a group of individuals, and mostly young, a lot of younger practitioners who were in some of the best academic institutions throughout China. So I guess I'll answer it that way. I think if you look at the largest population of forced organ harvesting or genocidal organs is the Falun Gong, but then Uyghurs, with roughly 13 million and roughly 2 million in concentration camps in Xinjiang are also targeted by the party.
Can I come back to you, Dr. Trey? You had, I think in your opening remarks, sort of downplayed the profit motive that might be operating here, other than for the doctors that are involved. And yet, I think we heard subsequently about billions of dollars being generated in this process. And my sense of it is that that's unlikely in the Chinese communist system to actually be flowing entirely to the doctors perpetrating these crimes. I just wonder, especially if this is a growth industry, as it seems to be, whether in fact the money isn't more of a factor than we're being encouraged to believe for the party, as well as for the infrastructure build out and the aspiration to be the dominant organ transplanting sort of capital of the world, if you will, China.
The profit is certainly an aspect, but we have to see the line of people that is involved in this. You have policemen, you have wards, guards who have to channel the practitioners from detention camps into the operation room. Then you have the doctors who conduct who perform the transplantation. In a way, the system in China is very much based on corruption, and the money that you generate from the transplantation is basically used as corruption to motivate people to get involved, to conduct these horrible medical procedures. So that if you take all of this into consideration, then a large amount of money is triggered, is used to trigger to maintain this system, and another aspect is used to build the infrastructure. But if you compare the money that is generated from transplants in China in comparison to other business and the general economy, and then the amount that which is in the realm of trillions, then the amount of money that the CCP is earning through transplantation is relatively small, and that's why I mentioned that the incentives that come with the transplantation might be different. For some, it is the money. The money is the incentive, the engine to propel this forward. But for the party itself, for the CCP, it is a different purpose behind it. And I actually would like to elaborate quickly on the Uyghur aspect that you mentioned before. There was a Korean film team that recorded a nurse, which in one of the hospitals, and she said that a large amount of transplant tourists would come from the Middle East, and for them, organs from Muslim Uyghurs would be a better prospect. However, I assume you and others, the audience, will remember when the Wall Street Journal showed these satellite photos of the detention camps in Xinjiang. When I saw those photos, and I thought, if the CCP allows this to be seen, if the CCP makes it visible, they knew that the satellite photo would show the expansion of the concentration camps, then this is probably used as a distraction. So we should not forget that there's one group that is in a declared enemy of the state in China, in all provinces, which is Falun Gong, and which is kind of kept concealed, while at the same time the China is using as one province, Xinjiang, a next small group of people, as a bait to give some information to the West about the crimes against humanity. So we need to be careful that we don't play the game of the CCP giving us a bait, while actually the bigger problem is staying concealed. And maybe this is also giving an idea about the financial aspect here, about the profit. The money is not as important for the CCP than establishing this control about in the transplant field.
Yeah. Well, I don't mean to suggest it's more important, but I think it's a twofer or a threefer, depending on what all you're counting. And Mr. Metas, I think I've got that right now. One of the things that has been described here is the willful blindness of those participating in this program. And I think you touched on it as you went through your exercise about intent. But is it possible that people participating in this kind of program, especially at this kind of level of activity, whether it's the hospitals or whether it's the doctors or whether it's the wardens or the guards or other aspects of it, are oblivious to the nature of the business they're in, especially if they're garnering such funds? And I guess I'd ask you this specifically, sir. It seems as though they would have to know that there is a demand and response facet to this that is unlike anywhere else in the world, that you can essentially, as I think several of you have suggested, order up the spare part you're looking for. And it'd be one of our guests asked which body parts are most in demand. And I think the answer involves ones that you don't live without. It's not just your second kidney. It's your liver, it's your heart, it's your eyes, what have you. But could you just talk a little bit about the plausible deniability that any of these people might have, and are they in fact, if you were able to identify, say, medical doctors engaged in this line of work in China, people who could be brought up on charges, prosecuted, civil action taken against them, what have you?
Well, I mean, we certainly know who the transplant doctors are in China. The hospitals, in fact, identify who they are. Willful blindness is not plausible deniability; it's implausible denial. The issue of willful blindness arises because you have to anticipate a defense if somebody's accused of this, of saying, "I didn't know." The way the system works for forced organ harvesting, again, as my colleagues have pointed out, is it's very compartmentalized. There's nobody who actually goes, except the victim, goes through the whole system. There's the people who do the blood tests. There's other people involved in the detention. There's people who in the prison system who bring the victims to the white van, which arises, and the people in the white van will inject drugs to immobilize the person, and fill them with anticoagulants and so on, and then extract the organs in the van. The organs are then brought to hospital. In extraction and insertion people are different people, and the insertion people in the hospital just get the organ. And
I'm sorry, could I interrupt you just for a second? You didn't mention along that litany anesthesia. Are these people anesthetized?
Well, yes, they'd have to be, because otherwise they would just squirm too much during the operation.
But they are very much alive at the moment.
They're alive,
this is taking place.
They have to be immobilized. They can't be moving during the operation.
But I thought that would have taken care of the squirming point, would it not? I've been told these people are not in every case being anesthetized, and I just wondered whether that. It just adds to the unimaginable horror of all of this, of course.
There's different forms of immobilization. It could be anesthetics is a common form of immobilization. It's not the only immobilization drug. And so there could be cases where somebody could be immobilized without being anesthetized. And especially somebody at the end of the line may say, like all the person at the end of the line in the operating room seizes the organ and may say, I have no idea. So this issue has come up actually at Nuremberg, where there was the trial of the major war criminals, but there was also a number of specialized trials in Nuremberg, and one of them was of the Nazi doctors. And that was typically the defense of the Nazi doctors. I did not know. I was just in the operating room. I didn't know who this person was. and I was just performing this operation. And that Nuremberg tribunal found these doctors, for the most part, guilty and sentenced them to death. And some of them were hanged on the basis of they were willfully blind. If they didn't know, they could have found out. All they had to do was ask. So I think it may well be that we could establish knowledge without the need for willful blindness, but I think it's important to keep it in reserve as an important component of knowledge.
Thank you. And I guess I'm going to ask each of you to just chime in as you wish. I think we've made the case, and I want to thank you from the bottom of my heart for doing so compellingly, that this is an abominable crime of against humanity taking place in our time, on our watch, if you will. It's genocide. I think we've made the case that it's intentional and knowing, and it is being done on a scale that is only growing. The question, can we do about it? Mention has been made by one of you to this idea of criminalizing America's participation in this process. That would seem to be an absolutely necessary first step. But what else are you recommending, and how far along are we towards getting any of it done?
Yeah, unfortunately, we're not very far along at all. I think the couple of things that I think are important are, number one, we need to decouple from the Chinese Communist Party and Chinese institutions. I think this is what we saw in the 2019 cases of 9 scientists and physicians leaving their post because of their ties to the Chinese Communist Party. But I really do think we need a massive decoupling with the knowledge and the awareness of forced organ harvesting and criminal activity happening. So I do think, as an institution, in our laboratories, in our operating rooms, in our clinics, we really do need a decoupling. And I think, unfortunately, that does harm the Chinese people and Chinese physicians, which, as I said before, is not the Chinese Communist Party. But I think as things stand right now, with no evidence to the contrary of forced organ harvesting, and I mean, no plausible evidence to the contrary, we need a massive decoupling. And I can tell you, I won't tell the whole story, but when I've tried to do that at my own institution, essentially what I've been told is that if we as a medical community and a medical institution take a stand, that China will stop sending its undergraduate and graduate students to our university. And so I think we have fear of economic retribution. I think we have fear of academic retribution. But I do think we need to acknowledge, Frank, just as you pointed out, that we are dealing with a criminal state, and we need a massive decoupling, both at the individual level all the way up to the institutional level from China.
Thank you. I couldn't agree more. Dr. Trey, what are your thoughts on what must be done about this, perhaps in addition to what's just been suggested?
We have to look at it in a timely perspective. Willful blindness 70 years ago is different than willful blindness today. We live in a world that is interconnected with social media. We can have any type of information immediately in a second. There is so much research done and investigation done over the past years. Willful blindness today has a different meaning than it had in the past. So if we don't take action, this is not only being silent, but it is actually fostering the crime against humanity. And I think this willful blindness needs to be reframed as supporting the crime against humanity. And if we have people of whom we think they are willfully blind, we should maybe switch to the term they support the forced organ harvesting. It shines a different light on the actual crime.
Yeah, enabling and complicity in this practice. I think you're absolutely right. People need to be held accountable, starting here in our own country. Mr. Matas, what is your further advice in terms of what needs to be done to try to curb this? If you wish to elaborate on a point you made, I think, earlier about the need to, for starters, raise awareness about it. I think many in our audience have responded with shock that this is even taking place. So education is a big piece of this, I think, and we're interested in helping in that regard if we can. But what else would you recommend, sir?
Well, when David Kilgore and I first began this work, as the others have mentioned some of the evidence we looked at, and one of the observations we made, and one of the reasons we came to the conclusion we did that this was happening, is that there was nothing to stop it from happening. No laws, no ethical standards, neither outside of China nor inside China. And now what we see is a shift. There are some ethical standards, there are some laws, there is an international treaty, but not enough. We need laws to prohibit the practice. We need laws abroad to prohibit complicity in the practice. We need ethical standards that deal, as Dr. Gilchrist has said, with contact, collaboration, the complicity with the institutions abroad. But we also need ethical standards dealing with patient-doctor confidentiality and contact. Doctors should be telling patients, if you are going to China for a transplant, someone may be killed for their organs. And that should be an ethical standard. And it isn't now in most countries. So it's what we need is to confront the problem head on and go through all of the various remedies that are available and implement the whole range of them.
I couldn't agree more again. And I thank you for saying that so clearly. I think we're going to leave it at that, though much more can be said and perhaps will be in the days to come. But I want to just put a fine point on everything that I've taken away from this so-called unethically sourced organs and the trafficking in them. This is a crime against humanity of the first order. It is shocking, but not frankly surprising that the Chinese Communist Party is up to their necks in it. The fact that they are doing it with impunity, they are profiting from it, though that may not be the prime motivation. It's a consideration, I'm sure, but so is the slow motion liquidation of their enemies. And it's extraordinarily, infuriating that we are witnessing this taking place at a moment when we're seeing the Chinese ever more aggressive, ever more bold, ever more threatening. And it brings me back to something that I think has been a kind of leitmotif of these programs throughout the several score of them. And that is, we're dealing with an illegitimate regime. And my old boss, Ronald Reagan, I think made a very important part of his determined effort to take down the last monstrous communist system that sought our destruction, namely the Soviet Union, by going right at the heart of its legitimacy, notably calling it an evil empire. We must do the same. And I think a transnational criminal organization is a way of getting at that. It has certain legal implications in the United States that I think could be helpful, especially a point that was not made in this webinar, but has been repeatedly in others, to the extent that we are financing what the Chinese Communist Party is doing in the way of unrestricted warfare. I wouldn't be surprised if some of the money that flows there is being used to facilitate the build out of this infrastructure. We certainly know that some of the companies that Wall Street invests in are directly involved in the incarceration and confinement of people like the Uyghurs and the slave labor factories and all the rest. So this is truly a horrific operation. And I think calling it such and treating it as such legally as well as rhetorically is absolutely essential if we're going to deal with the larger problem that we confront from the Chinese Communist Party, to say nothing of this specific horror. Again, let me just say to the three individuals we've heard from today who have devoted much of their professional lives to trying to raise awareness about what's going on here and to bring it to an end. Thank you for that service. Thank you, of course, for that you rendered by joining us to talk about it today, Dr. Torsten Trey, David Mattis, and Dr. Weldon Gilcrease. Your expertise is extraordinarily impressive, and so has been your thoughtful comments for today. I'm going to turn this back over at this point to my colleague, Dede Laugesen, who will, as always, explain how you can get access to this video, how you can share it with others, as you can, in fact, all of our videos. And I very much hope you will do so. Until next time, this is Frank Gaffney. Thanks so much for being with us.
Thank you, Frank. And thanks to everyone for being here today. A video of this webinar will post to presentdangerchina.org within a day or two of the end of our program. Please share this and our other programs with your elected representatives, colleagues, and other networks. And join us next Tuesday, January 10th at 1 p.m. Eastern for our next Committee on the Present Danger China webinar on the CCP's unrestricted warfare against America and the free world, and how the USA is betrayed by CCP-captured elites. Thanks again for joining us today, and goodbye.